Well, hello there. I'm back again. We're going to finish up our study of the peripheral nervous system by continuing to talk about the autonomic system. So, if I thoroughly confused you last time, I think this presentation will help you with a lot of things. I'm going to start this time talking about the effects of sympathetic system stimulation and the effects of parasympathetic stimulation. We have this system, the autonomic system, and it's there to control a lot of functions for us that are not cognitive and they are not skeletal muscle, but they're vital. I mean, we're talking about heart rate, the degree of bronchodilation we have in our lungs, the way our gastrointestinal tract works, our kidneys, and on and on and on. And it turns out that one of these divisions is operative during quieter times when we're trying to digest our food, we're eating, we're resting. The other one is in charge when we are in an emergency situation, and we call that fight or flight. Now, here's the thing. Many people think that if your sympathetic system is activated, it means you're in fight or flight. It does not, okay? And I envision it like this, that the sympathetic system is there in case of emergency. There are several effects that are going to make sense. When we talk about them, you can think about them in terms of fight or flight, and it'll help you to remember which way they go. But But it is also vital every day of our lives, even if we're not in fight or flight. And hopefully we're not in fight or flight all the time. In our society, sometimes our bodies think that we are, and sometimes we're not, and it causes us problems. But at any rate, I was talking about an autonomic reflex in which you're lying down or you're sitting down and you stand up suddenly and you feel transiently very dizzy, and then you feel okay very briefly after that. And that was an autonomic reflex that kicked in. That was your sympathetic system kicking in. And you were not in fight or flight. You were not in an emergency situation, but your brain experienced a transient decrease in oxygen supply because more oxygen was needed in your skeletal muscle because you were using the muscles more. And so the blood had to be rerouted from places that did not need it as much to places where more was needed, such as the brain. So both functions are important, the fight or flight aspect of sympathetic system, as well as the everyday vital reflexes and other activities that go on that are not dangerous, they're not emergency situations, but they utilize some of the same pathways. So having said all that, it is easy to remember the effects of sympathetic stimulation if you think about fight or flight, because you can say, boy, I can't remember what the sympathetic system does to the heart. But I know what happens to my heart if I'm nervous or I'm running or whatever. It speeds up. And then you say, oh, that's right. Sympathetic system speeds up the heart. So that's how you're going to look at it, okay? So let's look at the effects of sympathetic system stimulation. Increased heart rate. It stimulates an area of the heart called the SA node. And you're having that in your next lesson in our online course. We will be talking about the heart and the SA node. That is called the physiological pacemaker of the heart. It is where the heart rate originates by way of an electrophysiological message coming down from that area called the SA node. And in this case, just as in the control of skeletal muscle, you have the electrophysiological event that brings about the mechanical event, the contraction. So anyway, so the sympathetic system, when it is stimulated, it speeds up the heart. It also speeds up some other things with regard to the heart, such as conduction rate and force of contraction of the heart. Conduction rate means how rapidly that impulse travels from the physiological pacemaker, the SA node, down through the conduction system into the ventricles. So that's conduction rate. Force of contraction is just how forcefully the ventricles are going to contract. So these activities increase with sympathetic stimulation. And when you think about it, if you're frightened, sometimes you can feel your heart just boom in your chest like that. And that, again, that can make sense to you. The third one is bronchodilation. The bronchioles are the little tubes that deliver oxygen from the bronchi and the upper areas, such as the trachea and what have you, down to the alveoli of the lungs, where you have gaseous exchange. And so if the bronchioles are dilated, then you have more oxygen available for the blood and more oxygen delivery to your tissues. So that makes sense too, because if you're in fight or flight, what do you need? You need more fuel molecules to give your muscles enough energy for you to either flee away from the danger or stay and fight, whatever it is. And so in order to derive the most energy from your foods, you have to have oxygen. Remember that little edict? So that makes sense. Look at the fourth one. In keeping with that fact that you need more oxygen and you need more energy supply to your muscles, we have increased glycogenolysis by the liver and by the muscle. This means that you are breaking down glycogen more rapidly than normal, which is going to supply more glucose to your muscles. See how the first four so far make perfect sense with regard to fight or flight. These things happen when you're not in fight or flight as well. The fifth one. So let's see now. Yeah, I usually say number 6 before number 5. Let's look at number 6. Vasoconstriction. That means tightening, narrowing of the lumen of the blood vessel in the periphery, meaning the skin and mucosa, which leads to increased blood pressure. Here's the thing. You only have so much blood in your body, okay? And so if you have an emergency and your muscles need more blood, you can't all of a sudden go to the blood bank and say, give me another pint of blood because I'm in an emergency situation and my muscles need more oxygen. Of course, you can't do that. But what you can do is you can say, I have only so much blood, but I'm going to send part of it that is just lying around not doing much right now to a place where it's needed. And so you can shut down, or comparatively speaking, shut down one passageway or one set of blood vessels and dilate the others, and that is going to shunt the blood from areas where it is not needed at that moment to areas where it is vitally needed at that moment. So, constriction of the skin, blood vessels in the skin and the mucosa, that is a lot of blood vessels. You may not realize how many miles of blood vessels that is, but when you constrict those vessels, it frees up a whole lot of blood that can go to your brain to help you think, your muscles to help you run, and that kind of thing. Now we look at number 5, vasodilation of arterioles that supply the skeletal muscle in the brain. That's exactly what I was just talking about. You take blood from one area, you give it to another. You're going to increase blood flow to the brain and to the skeletal muscles. Number 7, decreased GI tract peristalsis. This means the rhythmic, involuntary activity of the GI tract, because after you eat, you have to digest the food. It has to be moved on through. It has to be absorbed. There has to be adequate time for the digestive and absorptive process to occur. And so you have to have all that. But if you're in fight or flight, again, you need extra resources go into certain areas. That is not a time in which you just have to be digesting food. It can wait a while, okay? And so what happens is everything in that area slows down. Digestion slows down, secretion of enzymes and digestive hormones is going to slow down. You're going to have an increased tone in your sphincters. Okay, so that's a good thing. So you can imagine why that would be, that you would want to go ahead and not be thinking about that at that time. Number 8 is similar to number 7, but it's a different system. In the urinary tract, you're going to have a decreased peristalsis as well. So peristalsis is not just something that occurs with GI tract muscle, it also occurs in other smooth muscle. So the smooth muscle rhythmic activity in the ureters is going to slow down. It's going to slow down in the urinary bladder. You're not going to have, oh, there's an insect or something, a little gnat. You're not going to have as much urine flowing down to the bladder, and the bladder is not going, it's going to relax, okay, so that you are going to be less likely to have to urinate right at that moment, and you're going to have increased tone in your urinary sphincters, urethral sphincters, which again will prevent you from having to urinate during that time. So to me, numbers 1 through 8 makes sense. Let's look at number 9. This one does too. You just have a little word to learn, mydriasis. That word means dilation of the pupils. When your pupils are dilated, you can get extra light into your eye that goes onto the retina, meaning you can see better. And so if you're in fight or flight, you need to be able to see. You need to be able to see where you're going if you're running away. You need to be able to see what you're trying to fight against. You know, I'm being kind of dramatic, but you know, if you think about eons ago when evolutionary changes were adaptations were being made in a world where there was a lot of selection pressure, and if you weren't careful, you were going to be someone else's dinner or some other animal's dinner, then this would have been really important to have these advantages like that. So dilation of the pupils, and then also lens flattening is number 10. So the lens, when it is flattened, you can see farther away. Okay, and so you could look at that in two ways. You could say, well, that's great if I'm trying to run away from danger, but what if I'm actually wanting to stay and fight the problem? Wouldn't I want to be able to see up close? Well, yeah, probably. But so that's one of those areas where it's not perfect, okay? It's not perfect. And this next one is not either. The number 11 is ejaculation in males and orgasm in females. So these are sympathetic system effects. And all I can tell you about that is that you need both systems, both divisions of the autonomic system intact for sexual function to work correctly. Okay, so I believe you can learn those 11 things without a whole lot of trouble. We are now going to go to the next slide, and it's going to tell you about parasympathetic nervous system stimulation. So you're happy to see there's not quite as many things to learn here. To a large degree, though, it's going to be the opposite of the sympathetic, and that always makes it easier to learn too, doesn't it? So you have to learn one of them and then remember the other one is the opposite. So parasympathetic system is the rest and digest system, I guess you could say. And so if you're resting, your heart rate is going to be lower. And so the parasympathetic system decreases the heart rate at the SA node, right there at the physiological pacemaker. Parasympathetic stimulation causes bronchoconstriction, the opposite of bronchodilation. It leads to less oxygen entering the bloodstream. Now, here's something I've always kind of thought about. Is bronchoconstriction ever good? I can't think of an instance in which it's good. But at the same time, you have to have both systems. You have to have one that's in charge most of the time, and then one that's going to be able to get a little bit more out of the system if necessary. And so what I didn't tell you is that we have innervation, both sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation to most of our effectors. And so this means that, say, the heart, the SA node, it has both sympathetic and parasympathetic influences. So one of those has to be the boss most of the time, and the other division has to be the boss under certain conditions. Okay, so for the SA node, the boss or predominant tone is going to be cholinergic. It's going to be parasympathetic. Okay. The blood vessel tone, on the other hand, the predominant tone is sympathetic. So it may not seem to have a rhyme or reason, but that's kind of the way it is. So at any given time, depending on circumstances, what a given smooth muscle group of cells are going to be doing is going to depend upon the relative influences of either division of the autonomic system. Look at number 3. It's the opposite of sympathetic. Parasympathetic stimulation increases secretions in the GI tract. It decreases the sphincter tone, meaning it is more favorable towards a bowel movement. There are increased secretions, increased peristalsis, and all of this means increased digestive activity, and that's going to promote digestion. Look at the fourth one. I'm sorry, 1, 2, 3. I see, I've got 1, 2, 3, 5. Okay, look at what says number 5. Increased urinary tract peristalsis. So you have more urine flowing from the renal pelvis of the kidneys down to the urinary bladder, okay, because of peristalsis. You're going to have decreased urethral sphincter tone. It's easier then to evacuate your bladder. And then I don't know why it doesn't say this, but you're also going to have the urinary bladder tone itself is going to increase. It's going to be more contractile under the parasympathetic influence. So all of that adds up to increased opportunity or tendency to urinate. Number 6 is called meiosis. It's not the same as meiosis, which I think most people say meiosis anyway. I'm the weirdo, I say meiosis. But this is meiosis, spelled differently, and it has a different meaning. This means pupil constriction. If the pupil is constricted, you are getting less light onto the retina. So why would that be good? Well, what if you're in bright sunlight? Bright sunlight. And you can't see a thing. When you've got so much sunlight flooding the retina, you can't see either. So you need to have that parasympathetic influence to kind of constrict it down, you see. Number 7 says lens accommodation for near vision. So there's a ciliary muscle that's going to be involved in loosening these little suspensory ligaments that hold the lens in place. And the lens is going to be allowed to round up. It's not going to be as flat. It's going to be rounder. And that's going to allow the incoming light rays to be bent or refracted more. And that is a long way of saying that it enhances your near vision. Okay. The last one having to do with the sexual function. Parasympathetic system has to be intact for erection in the male and for vaginal lubrication in females. So again, you can see sexual function requires both of the divisions of the autonomic system. Okay, so here is a slide that actually goes over some things that I had talked about in the previous presentation, and I think it might be a good thing to look at here. And we're looking at the cranial parasympathetic nerves and the sacral parasympathetic nerves, so at the top and at the bottom. And then we have our sympathetic or thoracolumbar nerves. Okay, so the craniosacral division is parasympathetic. Let's look at the brain, and we have a generalized, stylized little preganglionic fiber coming out of that medulla pons. It looks more like the pons, but at any rate, the brain stem. So here comes that blue preganglionic fiber. There's a nerve terminal there in the ganglion, and then there's a cell body of the postganglionic neuron. And then that postganglionic neuron has a fiber or an axon coming away from it, and it's releasing acetylcholine, and it is going to affect visceral effectors. What does that mean? The stomach, the intestines, the bronchioles, the ureters, etc. Okay, so I want you to notice that you have a long preganglionic fiber or axon. you have a shorter postganglionic axon. You can see that because you see where the ganglion is, right? So before the ganglion, there's a longer fiber. After it, there's a shorter fiber. Okay, so the ganglion is circled, and it's kind of in a tan color. Look at ACH that's written inside the ganglion. That tells you that acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter both in the ganglion and at the neuroeffector junction of the parasympathetic system. Okay, same thing is going on in the sacral division. The pelvic nerves are coming out. There's the preganglionic fiber. There's the ganglion. And that ganglion is on the surface of the organ being innervated. Okay, so it's not really circled in brown, it's little. But you have acetylcholine released at the ganglion and you have it released at the neuroeffector junction. Okay, so now look in the middle, that would be thoracolumbar nerves. And here they're coming out, and we're seeing the different types of ganglia in the sympathetic system. So the ganglion, the first one that you're seeing there, I'm saying the first one, it's the first red one coming off the thoracic cord. That ganglion, there's a short preganglionic axon and a longer postganglionic axon. The preganglionic cell body is in the thoracic part of the cord or the lumbar, depending. And the ganglion in this particular case is called paravertebral. And on the previous presentation, we saw a picture of the paravertebral ganglia for the sympathetic system. So that's one of those paravertebral ganglia. Acetylcholine is still the neurotransmitter. It is the neurotransmitter in all autonomic ganglia, well, almost all. And then the postganglionic cell body is there in the ganglion. That's the longer axon, and norepinephrine, NE, is being released at the visceral effector. Go down a little step and you see the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla is the middle part, medulla means middle, of the adrenal gland. And the adrenal medulla is basically, it's like a big old ganglion, really. It consists of these preganglionic neuron terminals and postganglionic cell bodies, but most of them don't really have fibers or axons going away from them. But instead, these products that would have been neurotransmitters at the neuroeffector junction, in this case, they're hormones that are being released into the bloodstream. And so when you see the arrow coming away from the adrenal medulla, it's a thicker arrow, it's red, that implies blood. The word hormone also implies blood. The neurotransmitters are released into the blood, and they're hormones in this particular case. E stands for epinephrine, NE stands for norepinephrine. Incidentally, epinephrine in our country is called epinephrine. In England, they call it adrenaline. It's the same thing, adrenaline. And in fact, when I was growing up, I learned it as adrenaline, and you may have too. And so, but at any rate, you hear people say, I had an adrenaline rush and I was able to get a lot done. You never hear them say, I had an epinephrine rush and I was able to get a lot of work done. So, but anyway, that E stands for epinephrine. The NE stands for norepinephrine. And these are similar hormones, and they are identical to neurotransmitters of the same type. Okay, the third type of ganglion in the sympathetic division is called the collateral ganglion, and we have a few of these, and they're kind of spread out in the posterior abdominal cavity, retroperitoneal, I believe, and so they are ganglia, which means that there is acetylcholine being released by the preganglionic axon onto the postganglionic cell body, and then you have your postganglionic fiber or axon extending to your visceral effector, and norepinephrine is being released there. And we've already looked at this, the sacral parasympathetic nerves. We've already looked at that region. So I want you to look at some commonalities. For the most part, your parasympathetic preganglionic fibers are very long and postganglionic fibers are short. For the sympathetic, it's the opposite, and it has everything to do with the location of those ganglia. The ganglia in the sympathetic division are just closer. They're closer to the spinal cord, so naturally the preganglionic fiber is going to be shorter. Another commonality is that acetylcholine is released at the ganglia, but it is also released for parasympathetic system at the neuroeffector junction. When it comes to sympathetic, it's different. It's going to be epinephrine, or mainly norepinephrine, being released from the postganglionic fiber at the neuroeffector junction. Okay, so I'm hoping this is beginning to dawn on not dawn on you, but it's beginning to sink in. I know it's a lot to take in. And so this picture, we're not going to dwell on this too long. This is a more detailed picture of what we were looking at on the previous slide. It is, in fact, it's one I was referring to a moment ago. You see on your left, there's the spinal cord, and in the blue, you have the cranial region and the sacral region where these parasympathetic preganglionic cell bodies are located. In the red, you have the thoracolumbar areas of the cord, and this is where your preganglionic sympathetic cell bodies are located. Okay, so if you look at, there's a little chain looking thing or a string of bead looking things in red. Those are all, each of the beads would be a sympathetic ganglion. And you know what happens there. There's a synapse between the preganglionic and the postganglionic fiber. Okay, and then look what happens after those postganglionic axons or fibers leave that ganglion. They go on out to the organs and they innervate the organs. They are supplying the organs with impulses. So I want you to look at the heart on the right. It's about maybe midway down the heart. And I want you to notice that we have, I'm trying to see here, we have a blue fiber coming into the SA node, and that blue is indicating, parasympathetic division. And then the red dotted lines, is indicating sympathetic division. The dotted lines are showing you postganglionic axons. The solid lines are showing you preganglionic axons. So I like this picture because you can, it sums up a lot of things that we've been talking about. And so it's just the same deal. We're looking at the different organs being innervated by the autonomic system. I'd like you to look at the very top where it says, close to the brain there, it says cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. We just talked about those on our last, or maybe, I'm not sure which one it was, but maybe a couple of presentations ago. But at any rate, remember cranial nerve 3 is the oculomotor nerve. And so the oculomotor nerve is a parasympathetic nerve. It is stimulated by acetylcholine being released at the neuroeffector junction. And so that's kind of a little insight, excuse me, into that little diagram. Okay, so this sums up what I was talking about. I didn't know where to put this slide or some of the others either. I just had to go with it. But this sums up some things. So we're looking along the left side. It's a column. We have characteristic across the top. The rows are going to be sympathetic or parasympathetic. So it says here, location of preganglionic cell bodies in the sympathetic, thoracic and lumbar parts of the cord, parasympathetic, the brain stem, and the sacral cord. Does that sound familiar yet? It should, because that's what we've been talking about. The length of preganglionic fibers is short for sympathetic and long for parasympathetic. Look at the locations of the ganglia. I'm not going to read that to you again, but we've looked at that a couple of times now. Look at your length of your postganglionic fibers. If the short one is, if the preganglionic one is short, the post is going to be long and vice versa, and it has to do with where the ganglia are located. Okay? It's showing us that the neurotransmitter at the ganglion, I'm about 3 up from the bottom. Neurotransmitter NT released at the ganglion is acetylcholine in both divisions. The neurotransmitter released at the neuroeffector junction. For sympathetic, it is usually norepinephrine. For parasympathetic, it is acetylcholine. Okay, and then finally, at the neuroeffector junction and the ganglia, this is telling you what kind of receptors are present. And so at the ganglia for both divisions, we have the N1 cholinergic receptor. At the neuroeffector junction, or NEJ, it's an adrenergic receptor. For the parasympathetic, at the NEJ, it is muscarinic. Okay? And by the way, adrenergic receptors come in 2 general types, alpha and beta, and muscarinic receptors come in several subtypes of the M receptor. All right, so this just tells you about the ganglia. We've already gone over that quite a bit. And so that shows in detail or up close the sympathetic chain. It also shows you the different little ways that these fibers are, communicate with one another. This shows the collateral ganglia. It also shows the adrenal medulla. I've already gone by. The adrenal medulla, which is a sympathetic ganglion as well. So this slide I'm on now talks about the terminal ganglia of the parasympathetic system, which we've talked about already. And this picture shows us the path of the vagus nerves. And when the vagus nerves, it's plural because we have one on each side, of course. So it's kind of hard for me to actually see this. I think it's trying to show us mainly our parasympathetic division. And, well, that's vagus, sorry. Of course, that's parasympathetic. The vagus nerves carry 75% of your parasympathetic impulses, with the other 25%, or most of the other 25%, being in the sacral area. So this just tells about the receptors. All of this I've already talked about, except that to say that when the NN, or the ganglionic receptors for acetylcholine, were first discovered, they were discovered in the electric organ of an electric eel. And so a lot of what's known about that receptor to this very day came from those early studies with the electric organ from the eel. There are different types of nicotinic N receptors, and they are all what we call ligand-gated ion channels. And acetylcholine is always excitatory. There are other nicotinic receptors. One is called NM, and that's at the neuromuscular junction, remember, for skeletal muscle. NCNS would be acetylcholine receptors in the brain and spinal cord. So these are the adrenergic receptors. This would be for sympathetic system. We have the alpha and the beta. Excuse me. So this tells you about those alpha and beta receptors just a little bit. That's about the beta receptors. And now this tells about the muscarinic receptors. They're called muscarinic receptors at the neuroeffector junction. So think about what we're talking about now. We're talking about at the effector, the SA node, the gastric smooth muscle, that kind of thing. The parasympathetic influence is mediated by a type of receptor called muscarinic. the neurotransmitter is still acetylcholine at that region, but it's called a muscarinic receptor. Okay? And I believe that completes our little study of the autonomic system. I don't want anybody panicking about this. I just want you to give it your best shot, see what you can do with it. I promise I'll be relatively kind on the exam, but I believe that you're going to enjoy this study of this particular part of the nervous system. Okay, I'm signing off for now, and I'll see you soon with a different topic. And I hope you have a good break, and see you later.